Well, hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I know this is a symposium about anti-Semitism, but we can sometimes have a smile on our face because that's the reality we've lived with just for a few thousand years. So my name is Eric Dinowitz. As was mentioned, I'm a New York City Council member, but I always like to tell people what I did before the New York City Council. And before I was Council Member Dinowitz, I was Mr. Dinowitz in the New York City public schools. I taught for almost 14 years, and I say, oh, you don't even know if I was a good teacher or not, so thank you. I taught for almost 14 years, and I didn't get the full 14 because I ran for office and joined the city council. And I taught most of my career in the Bronx. And one of the things that I promised my students and I promised to my community and I promised to myself was that all the stories that I learned in the classroom I would take with me to City Hall. And there's one in particular as it relates to the Jewish community and anti-Semitism that kind of stands out to me. Every year this would happen. Every single year when I was teaching, the holiday would come up and I would tell the students, you know, it's a Jewish holiday of Sukkot coming up, so I'm not going to be in school these 2 days. Please do not abuse the substitute teacher. And they would say, oh, mister, where's your hat thingy? How come you don't have the thingies on the side of your face thing? And through these... And I'll go, keep pay us. And it was, I guess these were high school students. So imagine 14, 15, 16 through 18, 19 years old. And in part, it was a good moment to teach them a little bit about who I am, about our culture and history. But it was also sort of astounding when you learn that in many cases, I was the first Jewish person they interacted with, or at least I was the first person they knew was Jewish that they interacted with, that their conception of Judaism was, a Hasidic person, right? A very religious person with the hat or a kippah, the payas, the beard, that stereotypical kind of view of a very religious Jew. And I had very mixed emotions about it. Students were very interested in me and my Judaism, but also why is it that students who are in high school having their first interaction with the way most Jewish people in their neighborhoods look. And there was one time when a student came up to me, this is later in the year, she was about 15 years old, and she looks me dead in the eye with a big smile, and she tried to compliment me, and she said, and she really thought she was giving a compliment, and she said, Mr. Dinowitz, you have nice eyes, like a Nazi. And yeah, a similar reaction to what I had. And I was like, huh? I was very confused by that because I thought I misheard her. I thought she repeated it. And I took her outside the classroom because I thought this is a good moment to have a conversation about the Holocaust. And, I explained, we had a conversation. I told her what the Holocaust was. And she yelled at me. And ran away. And, I guess, how does someone at 15 years old absorb the Holocaust? And she came back, and then she started to ask questions. She goes, Mr. Dinowitz, how come y'all didn't say anything? How come you didn't do anything? How come you didn't go anywhere? And I didn't have really good answers for any of those. I said, a lot of people did say something. A lot of people did do things, but we didn't really know how bad it would get. We had nowhere to go in many places. And I think about that story for a few reasons. And one is just those questions, those very basic questions that student asked. Why didn't we say anything? Why didn't we do anything? Why didn't we go somewhere else? And we have answers to those questions of, we know what happens when not enough people say anything. We know what happens when not enough good people do the right thing. And, we have some place to go now. and we should have more places to go. And there are people out there who want to deny us our ability to say something, to do something, and to go somewhere. People want to get rid of the state of Israel. People want to make it unsafe for us here in the United States and say, that's not really anti-Semitism. What you identify, what you as a Jewish person feel as anti-Semitism, it's not. Me, a non-Jew, I know better. And it's astounding to me that people are trying to put us in a position again where we are unable to speak up for ourselves. But the other reason I think about that story is I think it speaks to one of the critical needs we have here in New York City and really everywhere in the world, and that is education. I think we see a lot of the results of lack of education being expressed as anti-Semitism. We see students on college campuses being locked in libraries. We see death threats to students on college campuses. We see protests down the street saying resistance by any means necessary, which, as we know, looks like October 7th and the atrocities of October 7th. And then I think about my students who've never met a Jewish person before, who don't know about the Holocaust. Other students who couldn't identify a swastika when it's put in front of them, who don't have experiences with Jewish people and education. And I think about those students and I think, well, if I were a student who didn't know about the Holocaust, didn't know about Jewish culture or Jewish people, and then I see on social media, or I see in the news, or my friends are telling me on TikTok that, oh, this is what the Jewish people are doing. This is what they're saying. This is what they're about. It is very hard to push back against that. It's very hard when the student has no experience with Jewish people, not to mention what we need to do in our curriculum to, kind of ensure that our students have the ability to sift through fact, fiction, opinion, and fact, which are real needs here in our country. If you look at the international test, it kind of shows you a lot of students aren't able to distinguish between opinions and factual statements. Students aren't really being prepared to do secondary research and to ask the right questions. So there's curricular aspects, but there's aspects of it that are really involved in students interacting with the Jewish community, and of course, Jewish people interacting with the non-Jewish community. And so all of those things together, all of those things together, I take with me to the city council. And that's why when I was first elected, I started doing things like organizing trips for other council members to places here in New York City, like the Museum of Jewish Heritage, and abroad as far as Israel, where last year we took 12 council members to see firsthand the land of our people, the place where we say next year in Jerusalem every year. Those sorts of educational experiences for my colleagues are important, but it's also important for our students. And again, we can't just address anti-Semitism as it pops up on social media, because if you're a student who's believing everything you're seeing on social media or in the news, you probably don't have enough baseline of the Jewish community, who we are, and the educational aspects that go along with it. So we've engaged other members. At CUNY level, I chair the higher education committee in the city council. I've held a hearing on anti-Semitism on our CUNY campuses, and it lasted, I think, almost 7 hours, which is, I think, the longest higher education hearing I've ever had. I brought snacks. But through that hearing, we got CUNY to do things like create a centralized portal for reporting acts of bias, but also to make real investments. And to be clear, it is not enough. It is not nearly enough, because there are still problems. And we should not be in a world where a student's question about college isn't, what are extracurriculars like? What are academics like? Where their questions are, is it safe for me as a Jew? And so we've made movement on CUNY and pushed them, but it is not nearly enough. With the Department of Education in New York City, after October 7th, the chancellor released a very strong statement condemning Hamas. And to their credit, they tried to release educational tools to help teachers talk about it if that's what they felt they needed to do in the classroom. Unfortunately, they included in those resources news articles from news organizations like Al Jazeera and Amnesty International. But we pushed the DOE to remove those. And we're making moves with DOE. But the DOE is also not moving quickly enough. But we in the council are still working hard so that they and CUNY and everyone in the city recognizes the urgency of this. Because my feeling is that a lot of organizations, public organizations, have failed to recognize the urgency of this. And maybe even if they come close to it, they fail to be able to identify anti-Semitism and define anti-Semitism, and for some reason struggle with this free speech versus anti-Semitism. When the Jewish community is screaming out that this is how we are perceiving and experiencing anti-Semitism. We're pushing DOE, we're pushing CUNY, and we as a city council are making investments. When I was my first full year on the council in the budget, we got an extra, over $250,000 extra for the hate crimes initiatives. And what did that look like? It looked like addressing the problems I saw in the classroom. The money went to groups whose mission is to bring disparate communities together, to have those conversations, to build relationships, so that further down the line, we are not experiencing anti-Semitism, and other groups aren't experiencing other types of hate that we also see creeping up in our society as well. I'm working with other council members to rebuild the relationships between the Black community and the Jewish community. There's a lot going on in the council. It is work that I'm deeply proud of, but also work that I know is not even close to a lot, not even close to enough. And I see people here representing important groups like AJC who do really critical work. I don't know if there's other groups I could shout out here. I don't see the rest. I'm sure you're all doing really important work. But fundamentally, at its core, it's important we talk about holding institutions accountable, having that stick to disincentivize them from doing bad things. But we have to build on the education and build on our communities coming together. And I thank you all for being here, because that is what you are all doing. You are all educating yourselves, and I know you are all going back to your respective organizations and your respective communities to bring back from what you learned from from the esteemed panels you've been hearing from all day. And so, with that, I have the honor of turning it over to our next panel. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Eric, for those words, and thanks everyone for staying into the afternoon. My name's Jennifer Evans, and I'm professor of history at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, sometimes referred to as the other university. This is the panel on social media and online hate. I think I was invited here because I have written a little bit about this subject. I've recently written a book, Holocaust Memory in the Digital Mediascape, but I also oversee a big data, multi-platform social media study called Populist Publics that thinks about social media and historical misinformation, the way that history gets warped and used to make a certain set of arguments about the past, but for the present. And our panel takes up this question specifically of anti-Semitism in social media, made even more urgent after the attacks of October 7th. As much as the online vitriol has taken on a new intensity, which we all are living through at the minute, I think we forget sometimes that social media has a bit of a history now, too. And that means that online hate does as well. Twitter was founded in 2006. Facebook 2 years earlier, which means it's been around for 20 years, so long that our children think that it's really not their social media site anymore, right? Facebook since 2004, Instagram, now part of Meta, was around since about 2010. All three of these platforms function differently. They have different reach, They have different audiences. They have different affordances. They work differently. And they are by no means the only social media sites out there. We might think of Telegram's role in the Ukraine war, or end-to-end encryption servers like Slack and Discord, and TikTok's been mentioned, and of course China's most popular site, WeChat, with over 1.2 billion users. It doesn't even have to be one of the big, regular platforms. My own kids often saw anti-Semitic messages circulate on something as benign and kind of strange as Animal Jam, and anybody who has little kids knows that that's a hugely popular game targeted to elementary school kids. Don't get me started on virtual reality and online gaming. We know it's obviously a problem there too. Scholars in media and communication, data science, and increasingly the digital humanities are sorting out how to navigate these different forms of communication for their impact on spreading online hate. Made even more challenging in a moment when people like Elon Musk has ended our access to harvesting large-scale data sites, effectively cutting off access to the very empirical evidence that we need to be able to make sense of it all. And I think it's important, we've talked a little bit about social media today, to recognize that the bulk of us are chiefly users of social media. That means we're not analysts of how it functions. And one of the things that I've learned as the PI of this big data project with data scientists is that it really is a specialized form of knowledge that it takes to really understand how echo chambers work. So I think we need to be a little humble in recognizing that this is a very big problem, and we're, by and large, ill-equipped to actually deal with it effectively as users. People are navigating these very difficult conditions to think through what we are seeing and experiencing in real time. And these three panelists will share with us their experiences interpreting anti-Semitism and online hate, what it looks like, who is behind it, and what we might be able to do about it today. So let me introduce the three speakers and get right at it. Sabine von Mering is Professor of German and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and Director of the Center for German and European Studies at Brandeis University. Together with Monica Hübscher, she co-edited Antisemitism on Social Media, which came out with Routledge in March 2022. And the slightly updated German translation will be coming out with Budwig Verlag in 2024. Gunther Jikeli holds the Erna B. Rosenfeld Professorship at the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism in the Bourne's Jewish Studies program at Indiana University. He heads the research lab Social Media and Hate. His latest research report, Holocaust Distortions on Social Media After 10/7, shows the anti-Semitic mobilization of references to the Holocaust. Mike Rothschild is a journalist and author who specializes in conspiracy theories and misinformation. He's written 3 books, including last year's Jewish Space Lasers, The Rothschilds, and 200 Years of Conspiracy Theories. As a subject matter expert, he has testified to Congress on election fraud, conspiracy theories, was cited in the January 6th committee final report, and has given hundreds of interviews to media outlets around the world. So a much esteemed panel at that. All have studied the phenomenon of anti-Semitism on social media, and we're going to hear from them today, starting with a very maybe broad question to gather their thoughts, and that is, in thinking about anti-Semitism on social media, what are you most concerned about? How would you define the main threat? And I thought we'd maybe go Sabine, Gunther, and Mike to keep in the order of things here.
All right. Thank you, Jennifer. And I think you should also mention that that truck holds your book as well. So whoever finds it should let us know. So what is different in anti-Semitism on social media? What's really different, and I think it's important to remember that this when we talk about hate on social media, anti-Semitism isn't the only form of hate, right? It's not even the biggest by far. It's comparatively small when you look at other forms of hate. But of course, it targets Jews and Jewish institutions, and in some cases also non-Jews. What's new is that it's borderless, as was already mentioned earlier, and what my colleague Jonathan Sarna said, it's a phenomenon that has always existed, that people who want to act violently are particularly good at using new media, new technologies for their purposes. And so what we have here is a tool that is very useful for the spreading of hate, because it's algorithmically amplified, right? And the algorithms, that's unfortunately the case, have been designed such that the more negative, the more polarizing the information, the more engagement, and of course the more engagement, the more money the companies make, which is, it's also anti-Semitism for profit, right? Because the companies that you mentioned are huge companies that are profiting handsomely from the most horrific posts. It is user-generated, right? So anyone can post anything at any time, and you can see it anywhere. And of course, the anyone includes people who don't actually exist, like fake users. And it also has all sorts of forms. Anti-Semitism doesn't just come in the form of text or images or video, but also in the form of highly hidden forms that are difficult to detect. And so for all of these reasons, it outpaces any efforts at curtailing it, which is why it's posing a huge problem. And many have written about this. The Facebook whistleblower, Frances Haugen, for example, Yaron Lanier, 10 arguments for deleting your social media accounts right now, which is a fun read, especially for young people. And there was even a Congress hearing, right, organized by Debbie Wasserman Schultz at the end of 2022, where the social media companies basically said nothing, right? They gave them nothing. And so I think that is what's unique, what's new about this phenomenon. The anti-Semitism isn't new, but the ability to spread it widely.
Yeah, that's really great, because what you bring up is that there is a prehistory to the online hate that we're experiencing. I wonder, Gunther, if you wanted to speak to that a little bit.
Yes, that's right. Before I start, I just want to thank really the organizers for this extraordinary event here, that we come together. So thank you both, Professors Rosenfeld. Thank you, and all others, of course, who are involved and who have made this possible. It's a time where I feel also often isolated and don't find the right people to speak to about many of these concerns, so that's a really great opportunity. Thank you. So yes, it's it has a long history, and this morning we heard from Professor Sarna as well that yes, there was print that was used for dissemination of anti-Semitic pamphlets, very much so, than the radios, film, of course, and now social media gives another dimension to it, and that is also specific. And you also mentioned what I found interesting, that as scholars, our task, scholars of anti-Semitism, is to describe the specificity of the time, and this now is a dimension where most of the dissemination of anti-Semitism happens. Not all of it, but most of it. And also the online form is our lives, in the lives of most people, the online and offline forms, you cannot really distinguish that so clearly. It's a combination of it, and most people have at least some part of their social life as well, also online. It's part of it. And so this makes it's a new dimension. And what is also a new dimension in this technology is that it goes in many directions, And it enables the emotionalization much stronger than other media forms. It's really designed even to speak to emotions. And we have studied emotions and the impact that can have rumors that trigger emotions. The most devastating, I think, or one of the most devastating rumors that has led to violence, to pogroms, is the blood libel. And these kind of, the social media has become I would say, the biggest rumor machine that has ever been invented, or can be used as such, and across borders, across also different internal communities. That means it allows people, and especially with the small snippets that we're used to consume in social media, just to take small parts of some ideology and combine it together, and that allows people from very different backgrounds, ideological backgrounds, different political affiliation or other affiliations, to combine this and to unite and to mobilize even. So it becomes, of course, dangerous. The anti-Semitism always becomes dangerous when it's the political anti-Semitism. Bernard Harrison wrote a wonderful book about this, where he pointed this out, the political anti-Semitism. And so political campaigns become easier with social media. So far, after the Second World War, we had only few, and rather on the margins of society, organizations that had anti-Semitism as their core. And what social media allows is that those who have this at their core, that they unite and they attack, and that we have seen campaigns, organized campaigns in social media already. And I think recently there are two main things that anti-Semites can really mobilize politically, and that's one is the attack of the Holocaust memory, and the other one is Israel. And for different reasons that can trigger emotions, and then people can unite behind that from all different parts of political affiliations or some other circles. But I want to stop here, and then we have a second round.
Yeah, in the green room, Mike was telling us that he's been researching conspiracy theories for some time now, so an analog versus digital maybe comparison might be useful for us. Wonder, Mike, what do you think some of the main issues are, the main threat in terms of your work?
Sure. So there's a real perception that the internet and social media have made us more conspiratorial, that more people are conspiracy theorists, more people are anti-Semitic. And I don't necessarily think that's true, because I think that conspiratorial mindset has always been there. There have always been people who believed there was a dark cabal that was keeping us down, and they were the only people who knew about it. What the internet in general and social media in particular have done is that they've mainstreamed all of this. They've normalized what used to be very fringe and the kind of attitude that most people didn't want anything to do with. If you had some conspiracy theorist person in your life or a hardcore anti-Semite, you didn't want anything to do with that person. You dreaded, running into them at Thanksgiving. And now the barrier to entry has been completely removed because of social media. To be a conspiracy theorist or a sort of hardcore extremist, even maybe 10 years ago, you had to put some work into it. You had to know where the weird bookstore was. You had to renew your subscription to Soldier of Fortune magazine. You had to tune into shortwave radio at 3 o'clock in the morning. That's all gone now. And you can now log on to Facebook, and you can go to your group of cute cat pictures, and you can go to your group of grandchildren photographs, and you can go to your group of George Soros rules the world memes. And it's all mixed together. There's no barrier to entry for spreading conspiracy theories. There's no barrier to entry for creating conspiracy theories. I've seen people who had no real social media footprint, who just created a conspiracy theorist persona for themselves, and within a year, that's their job. And they're making so much money off of it that they don't need to do anything else. Because it is so easy to spread this stuff. It flies around so quickly before anybody in the square normie world can debunk it, can figure out what it is, where it comes from, what the danger is, should we be talking about it. Those people have no scruples about any of that. They just spread it. And we are really playing catch up with how the conspiracy theory world has adapted to the internet and to social media.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think it really, you can clap. It really segues nicely into this second set of questions around the specific kinds of methods that you use in doing this work. As I said in the outset, we are all incensed by what we're seeing, and we all, have opinions about what is circulating online, but we're not necessarily experts in how these ideas and how these platforms, how these programs of hate function. And so I thought it would be useful for the panelists to reflect for us on their methods, their methodologies for dealing with some of these questions. And so maybe we'll start with Gunther, then Sabine, and Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. So this is, I've been thinking about how to make sense of what we can see on social media for some years. And because there's so much stuff, it's like mass data or big data. Nobody can read everything that's online. It's just impossible. Even if you're a big group, it's just impossible. And Jennifer, what you said in the beginning, yes, it needs to, I think you were going into it, needs a team of at least some expertise to even go into that. And I was lucky, I've been lucky that we have this research lab with some students. Some students are here as well. I see Mabel in the room, and David, I'm not sure if he's still there, but so we have thought about this together, and we know now that on any of these platforms, even the big platforms that have some policy out there to reduce anti-Semitism or Holocaust denial, and some of them do some bits of it, but even on those platforms, if you know how to look for it, you can just find anything imaginable of hatred against Jews, including like literally killing of Jews in a video. So these kind of things. So how do you make sense of it now? What are your measurements? It's not good enough to say, well, to point out this exists, because we know this exists, yes. So what's the impact of it? So you need to find some ways of quantifying it and seeing the impact of it. So one thing is that we try to, you need mixed methods. So one thing is that we try to get some representative samples of conversations, for example, about Jews on Twitter. And so we get all tweets that have the word Jews in there, but also, of course, many people use then, speaking about Jews not using that, but at least some kind of representativeness we have. And then we looked at the timeline. So we did this from 2019 to early 23, and we have representative samples for then 4 months periods. And then we see some kind of things going up and down, more and more, less anti-Semitism. So it started in 2019 with about 7% of the conversations about Jews were anti-Semitic. And that translates, of course, into hundreds of thousands of such tweets. And our last 4 months period that we looked at was early 2023, and that went up to 21%. And in between, there were ups and downs. And you can see, for example, in May 21, there was a big uptick as well, close to, I think, 90%, because of the conflict that was related to that. In Gaza at that time, and now it's going way up again. So we need to have different ways. Now we looked at, after October 7th, we looked at if people look for information about the Holocaust, what do they find? So we looked at 5, 6, 7 different platforms and looked at what if people type in the Holocaust and look for it, what do they find? So on the bigger platforms, you get some information in there. They have, since a few years, they have some policy in there that they say they want to, that they on YouTube. They want to crack down on Holocaust denial, and they give you some information, right? But on some, but then you get also some like videos or posts or so, and some of the comments tend to be then are anti-Semitic. And on the fringe platforms, what we saw on like platforms that are used by the far right, but also that we saw then on Twitter, that we see when people look for information for the Holocaust, they get a lot of Holocaust denial, Holocaust distortion, and what we saw increasingly, and that was a really shocking revelation to me, that there was a mobilization, that the remembrance of the Holocaust is used to mobilize for the killing of Jews. So this is this we saw on some trends, and we saw that in memes as well, how memes are used. So we saw some, you might know or even have seen some of these memes, paragliders who were part of the organized Hamas pogrom who invaded Israel. And this was used by some alt-right people to have that combined with an image of what they use, Pape the Frog, as a paraglider, so they identify with the Hamas terrorists and say that this is a good thing and we want to promote this. And it's getting increasingly easy to produce such images. You can type in with AI very easily, give me an image that does this and this, and it gives you image, and you can pick, and it's super easy to produce that and disseminate what you said. It makes it so much easier. I'll stop there.
Maybe, Sabine, maybe because your book came out before October of this year, maybe when you speak to method, can you also speak a little bit about what's changed since the book came out, and things that maybe you've contemplated in the days and months since October 7th?
Yeah, okay. So the book Antisemitism on Social Media came up, we actually wrote it in the pandemic, and Gunther's team contributed a chapter. I had met Monica in Haifa when I actually presented on the right-wing German use of social media in the context of climate denial. And she was looking for literature on this and on right-wing uses of the social media platforms, and found out that there was basically no research. And so we then recruited Gunther and others for this volume, and it was very important to us. It became the first book on the subject in 2022. That's almost 20 years after Facebook. So that's a little late, right? And that was also our experience in compiling it, that many people were hesitant to contribute because they didn't feel they knew enough about social media, right? So we really wanted to make sure that in the volume we have different platforms, that chapters focusing on different platforms, using different methodologies, so that we can sort of show people how it can be done, and then more people will hopefully do it. And one of the the chapter that we co-authored, we also talked specifically about the need for expertise that straddles these different contexts, because anti-Semitism scholars, as you saw all day today, tend to be historians, right? That is sort of why someone studies anti-Semitism, because they're interested in history, and they're not necessarily computer scientists. And yet, when you want to tackle this issue on social media and the conspiracies and so on, you need expertise in very different areas, and that's really hard to find. And I think one of the outcomes of this book, we hope, is that schools will realize we need to train people differently. We need to create different kinds of programs and teach students that are interested in anti-Semitism to also understand how to work with different forms of software to, we sort of model what can be done in the book by showing different methods, and you can do interviews, of course, and you can do historical analyses, but there's several chapters that specifically use software to show that. And I would say to your last question, what changed since October 7, of course, was that in the book, when we were finishing up the book, we mentioned the case of Myanmar and other cases, and we describe hate on social media as violence, as a form of violence. And we discussed how this could look if someone took it to the next level with regards to anti-Semitism. And then, of course, that is exactly what happened on October 7 when Hamas terrorists literally used social media, and social media companies actually should be held accountable for being available to such uses, right? So I think there is a whole other sort of, Monica calls it mimetic warfare in the German version of the chapter that, that wasn't there before, and that needs to be studied as well.
Before Mike jumps in, I just want to make sure that folks take the opportunity maybe now to write some of your questions and start handing them forward, because we aren't going to have too much more time. What you've heard, I think, that came out to me from what Sabine and Gunther just said, is that it literally takes a village to do a lot of this work. It takes large teams. It takes a lot of funding. So, let's put pressure on the Social Science Research Council, Canada's SSHRC, NEH, all of these places to continue funding this kind of work. But at the same time, then there are people like Mike who work, on their own, or at least with their own resources. Maybe, there's something to be said for the fact that, you aren't, part of a research university. You're doing this work because you are motivated to do so. And so maybe you could speak a little bit about your methodology and your way into this.
Sure, I would love to. So for me, one of the things that I learned very early on in writing this stuff and looking into it is that conspiracy theory content creators are at heart very lazy, and they really like to recycle things from one iteration to the next. So what I really like to do is look at the current popular influencers in the conspiracy world and trace their path back through the works that inspired them, that inspired the people before that. So a really good example, and I write about this in my book, Jewish Space Lasers, is Alex Jones. Still hugely influential. I mean, yes, he is a buffoonish figure who drinks on the air and owes the Sandy Hook families $1 billion, but he is still extremely influential. Now, Alex's influences, he's talked about this many times, are books like 1971's None Dare Call It Conspiracy, written by two prominent members of the John Birch Society. Those guys, in turn, were influenced by the book Secrets of the Federal Reserve by Eustace Mullins, who is a very understudied figure in the conspiracy world. Was one of the first people who really bridged the gap between kind of anti-Semitic financial conspiracy theories, medical conspiracy theories, scientific racism, all of that stuff. Eustace Mullins has been a guest on InfoWars many times. Mullins was a protege of Ezra Pound, of course, the poet and fascist, who was one of the leading figures in the anti-Semitic isolationist movement before the Second World War. So there is a ladder from the supposedly cutting-edge influencer of today back through the generations, through these works that were very popular in certain circles, but were not really talked about very much in the rest of the world because they were hard to get or their ideas were unpalatable, but there were people reading this stuff. There were people listening. So one of the things that I really like to do is take these past conspiracy theories, these past scams, these past movements, and link them to what we're going through right now. And another example I'll talk about is QAnon. And I wrote a book about QAnon. It seems very cutting edge. It seems very, social media and decoding things. It's like a Tom Clancy book. It's not really new at all. the decoding cryptic clues. That's been a part of numerology and things like the Bible code for decades. Some of the other aspects of it are based on currency scams from the 90s and the aughts. Obviously things like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the blood libel. If you go back and look at the component parts of these theories, they suddenly seem a lot less mysterious. And their sheen comes off of them, and you suddenly realize why people believe this stuff. They believe this stuff for the reasons that they've always believed this stuff, because it explains the way the world works. It tells them what's going on, what's really going on, and who is to blame, and who is doing it to them. And if you have a group of people who are convinced that there is a dark cabal that is keeping them down personally, it's not a very long jump to that cabal is funded by the Jews, run by the Jews. They have their meetings in their secret Jewish tunnels with their secret Jewish hats. And it's the same thing that we see over and over and over again. And the difference is just that it moves a lot faster. And as I said before, there is no barrier to entry now.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. It is shocking when you stop and think about it too. We have a question. Whenever you do this work, whether you're testifying in front of Parliament, I have students as part of my project called upon to share the insights. Where do we go with this information? What are the suggestions for next steps? What are the opportunities for fighting back against the surge of anti-Semitism? And what are the challenges? And so I thought I'd ask the panelists, starting with Gunther, what are the challenges given the current media landscape, and is policy the answer?
Yeah, there have to be answers on many fronts, but we just heard about the landscape of a little bit of the problems that we see on social media in terms of anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories. And then October 7th happened, and we witness, offline, a wave of anti-Semitic incidents, but online it's even more drastic, what we see. And I just said about this mobilization, what we saw before as dissemination, we see now, there was before October 7th, we saw a lot of dissemination of anti-Semitic ideas. We see that still, but we also see a mobilization for anti-Semitic action. So that's a step further. So what do you do with that? So how do we, and how can we combat it? And so this is, I think the October 7th is really a crucial moment when the world saw, and nobody can say she doesn't know, that a pogrom happened, and it was almost live streamed for everybody. And it was so clear who's the perpetrator and who are the victims. Perpetrators, Hamas, the victims are the Jews in Israel, civilians for most part. And this contradicts the narrative that most people have been used to, have been fed to for many years. We heard earlier in the sessions today. So what do you do with it? Either you have to revise your narrative completely and see, well, the Jews are suppressors, this obviously is not right, or you double down. And social media gives you the opportunity to double down easily, because you can take it from so many different sources and combine it, and you can double down so easily. So this accusation then against Jews, against Israel also, but against Jews in general, of genocide, being responsible for genocide now against Palestinians, we heard this also earlier, turns it on its head. But social media makes it easier to follow through with this argument, which is, in many ways ludicrous, but it gives it more legitimacy. And then also offline, there are things that you can use them. So what to do about it? Yes, social media companies, and we've seen that they can do a lot of things you cannot suppress anti-Semitism completely, but you can push it to the borders, and you can say, this is not acceptable. in your classroom, in your university, in your town, also on social media platforms. And you cannot enforce it always 100%, but you can at least signal this is not acceptable. And social media platforms can do that with the help of algorithms. If they want to do it, they can do that more effectively, push it down, that it's not so visible, that it's not in your face all the time, and it's not so widespread. So yes, a lot of things can be done, but the signaling, what is okay, what's not okay, this is important in all spaces, including social media.
You know, and when we encounter, and we all have, I'm convinced, anybody that's online, we all feel that urge, that necessity of pushing back, and of course that's the way to deal with hate. And yet, social media is a bit of a wild west, and my students, you know, when they come onto the project, are desperate to get into these spaces and to start duking it out with the haters. But there are very real consequences for doing this, and I don't always think we appreciate the dangers. And so I thought maybe, Sabine, you could speak a little bit about this from the perspective of, you know, a project leader. And then Mike, I would love for you to share some of your experiences of being on the front line, just by way of really educating all of us about the urge and the desire to make right, but that there is a cost that I think we all have to be very aware of.
Yeah, so when we teach our kids that they shouldn't tolerate hateful conduct around them, and that if someone near them is attacked somehow, they should interfere, they should help. That in the real world, that makes a lot of sense as long as you feel safe, right? But in an algorithmic context, you are actually amplifying the hateful content by engaging with it, right? And most people don't understand that. Most people don't understand that if they click dislike, all the algorithm sees is engagement, and therefore more people will see the hateful content. And so that is why social media literacy is so important, that everyone, not just young people usually get this faster, right? But there's a lot of old people on social media. And we all need to be educated on how an algorithmic context is different from an offline context. So that's one. The regulation piece, I think, is really critical, because these companies are making a fortune, and they are not spending a fortune on actually moderating the content, removing, deplatforming, actually hiring competent people to remove hate. That's also something they should spend money on, right? And that's not right. And that's not just for anti-Semitism, that's for all forms of hate. Women are targeted the most on social media, so you know, there's a lot of work to be done. We need to study this phenomenon, we need to research it more. And I want to say, and this will not get me applause in this room, but you know, feminists have been accused of silence. We have been silent all day today about the 25,000 people that have been killed in Gaza, most of them children and women. And even the IDF says that less than half of them were terrorists. So we need, and we're better than that. We can have a critical conversation about the Middle East, about what Israel is doing, about where we stand, and we can educate about this in a way that will move things forward. So there needs to be critical dialogue, there needs to be there needs to be conversation across differences, and we need to stop putting each other into places where we just corner each other more and polarize each other more, which is exactly what social media thrive on, right? Instead, we have to have these difficult conversations, and we have to find ways to overcome what is clearly a devastating situation and is harming us. I mean, the research that Gunther has done has shown that whenever the conflict flares up, anti-Semitism flares up, right? So they are connected, and it isn't right for us to ignore that. That's really important. Oh, and can I add just one thing? Today, the New York Times, I don't know if anyone saw this, the weapons that Hamas is using are weapons that are ammunition that Israel fired into Gaza, that they are taking apart and putting back together again somehow.
So, Mike, how about you share with us the experience of doing this work and the kinds of things that you've had to navigate just personally to be able to bring this to us?
Sure. So it's hard to cover this material because there's always the line between talking about it and therefore platforming it, or ignoring it and not giving it oxygen. And I constantly scream to the high heavens that ignore it and it'll go away, don't feed the trolls, none of that works. And ignoring these things doesn't mean that they go away, it just means that they grow with nobody paying attention to them. Having said all that, when you are at the center of a trolling attack, the only thing you can do is ignore it. And I've gone through this personally, and also acknowledging, first of all, that I'm a white male, and therefore my online experience is much more pleasant than really any woman or any person of color in any public-facing field. So I definitely acknowledge that. But I've gotten it pretty hard a few times. Last summer, I did an interview on CNN about the, quote, anti-trafficking movie, Sound of Freedom. It was 2 weeks of constant attacks, and I'm being trolled on Fox and Friends. I'm being trolled on Steve Bannon's podcast. Alex Jones ranted about me for an hour. And you're seeing people say these horrific things about you that are unprintable, that you know are not true, that are probably defamatory, but there's nothing that you can really do. Because what they want is for you to respond, is for you to get angry, for you to get emotional, for you to let them know that their attacks are working. Because a lot of these trolls, they really are like sharks with blood. When they smell blood, they will attack even more. They will not listen to anything you have to say. Your denials are only going to feed them. So the best thing that you can do is just ignore it. Tighten up your notifications as much as you can. Definitely make sure that your own personal information is not out there. I pay for a service to delete sort of white pages mentions of me and things like that. I don't talk about my family in interviews, ever. So I keep my own information pretty buttoned up. I keep my social media notifications buttoned up. And when these things happen, you kind of just have to duck down and wait for the storm to pass, because they will always find another target. They will get bored with you if you don't push back, and they'll move on to somebody else. So the best thing to do is just don't read it, don't comment on it, unplug, do anything else, wait for them to get bored with you, and then they'll move on most of the time. But it's really unpleasant, it's really scary. It's not fun to be talked about by name on Fox News, but it does pass, and they will move on. And if you just let it go and try the best you can to not take it personally, it really serves you better both personally and professionally.
And I think everybody wants to clap for Mike. Let's do it. I think it's also important to recognize that everybody wants this information out there. So universities are very keen to lead, to ask scholars to be very public, to be more and more public, to be public-facing intellectuals. But the universities don't necessarily have harassment policies that are strong enough to deal with the kinds of backlash that people doing this work get. So there has to be some real change to actually protect those that are doing that kind of work, and especially if we're involving our students, because they don't have, they're young, they don't know how to navigate this any better than we do. And since this sounds really awful, doom and gloom, and there've been a couple of really great questions asking for help on what we could do. Maybe we thought the panel could offer up some silver lining, some examples of things, initiatives that actually showcase the way that social media can also be used to shore up, opposition and shore up civil society. So maybe all three of you, just in the order that you are here, Sabine, Gunther, and then Mike.
Well, there's a lot of good content on social media about educating about anti-Semitism, educating about the Holocaust, educating about Jewish life, giving Jewish social media users also places to feel safe and to engage. And so, those are important sort of forces that are not counter forces directly because they shouldn't be, right? But they exist, and they're spaces that are to be celebrated. And I think, I mean, the wave that we're witnessing now will probably not leave us unless we find a two-state solution. But I think on social media, I've already said, we need regulation, we need moderation, we need actual consequences for the platforms, and they have to pay if they don't do it.
Gunther, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so when we see anti-Semitism on social media platforms, it basically comes down to two factors. One is, who are the users, what do they put out, and what do they like and dislike? And the other one is, how do the social media companies deal with that in terms of what they signal and how they use their algorithms. So these are the two factors. So for a long time, the social media companies just said, well, it's not really us, it's our users, and then they are responsible. But these are the two responsibilities here. But also the users. So we need to work, think about these as human beings, even though we have trolls who really focus on, and also people whose business that has become, they earn money with this because it's emotional. And whatever the trigger moments are, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not the source of anti-Semitism, never the source of anti-Semitism, what Jews do or don't do, but it's a trigger. And it's one of many triggers. We didn't speak about COVID. COVID was also a trigger for many conspiracy theories about Jews. And so what kind of trigger moments are there? And why people have this? So it needs to really eventually have a reflection on people. Why do they get triggered, and then translate this into anti-Semitic resentments and let this out? But this is a huge educational goal, and we are really we're trying to reduce the harm now and the violence. So that is really the mobilization of anti-Semitism is what I see now. Not only discourse as anti-Semitic discourse, but really the mobilization that anti-Semitic people unite and form organizations, and organizations unite and use social media for that. So the mobilization, how do we stop that? So that needs to be addressed by also politicians, by the social media companies, and by everybody, frankly. So I don't see right now a good development anywhere. There are some, in recent years, I think, last 5 years, there has been more of an awareness also among politicians that something needs to be done, and slowly, and then the social media companies get some pressure, but it's not enough. And it's also, we need to know more about what social media companies, how they function and who they are. And that was mentioned earlier as well. There are some social media companies, they are based in the United States, and they usually, their main interest is profits to earn more money. Then you have social media companies who are based in other countries and influenced by the governments of other countries. And what do they do? What do they want? So it can be much more harmful. So the potential for more harm is obviously there. So we need to figure out how to reduce really the impact there.
And Mike, you're going to have the last word, because I know that time is an issue for this panel, and in order to make time for the following one. So last thoughts from you, Mike.
Sure. So in terms of a solution, I don't have any sunshine and rainbows, sadly. But I do think that we can be solutions for ourselves. We can monitor our own digital hygiene, and certainly nobody in here would share an anti-Semitic meme, but everybody has probably shared something that later turned out to not be true, be taken out of context, be fake, be a story from a dodgy source. So for us, personally, as people who are very aware of the power of hatred and extremism and social media, we can check it in ourselves. If we see something and something in us says, I don't know if this is true or not, this doesn't sound right, take that extra second and look at it. It may be true, and you can share it, and it's fine, and it may not be true, and you're stopping maybe somebody else from reading it and sharing it. You know, one of the other things that we can do is really understand what some of these terms mean and how they're thrown around. When people say things like globalist, like European financiers, we know what they're talking about. They may not always know what they're talking about, but we know what they're talking about. So if you do have somebody in your life who is sharing this kind of stuff, don't have a big fight with them publicly because they're just going to dig in more. You can't ridicule people out of this. You can't debunk your way out of this. But privately, reach out to them and say, hey, I saw that you shared this term talking about globalists. Do you know what that means? Do you know where that comes from? I think a lot of people don't actually want to share anti-Semitic and hateful material. They just share things that sound like they could be true. So if there is that person in your life, reach out to them privately. Don't make it a big deal. Don't look at them as somebody who's hateful, because they're probably not. They probably just made a mistake. And people don't generally want to make those kinds of mistakes. So there are opportunities for very small-scale interventions, but in terms of sort of large, scalable interventions, we would have to rely on the government or the social media companies to do that. The US government, at least certain people are trying. The social media companies will never try, so don't look to them for a solution. We really have to be the solution to the problem in our own life.
And I think that's really an excellent point to bear in mind, that social media is double-edged, and we all know that it can be used for bad, and we've witnessed that and are still witnessing it. But there are creative and inventive ways in which not just the kids today, but that folks are trying to take it back. And I think that it's important to support those kinds of initiatives, whether that's for critical digital literacy, whether that's for bringing this kind of analysis into the classrooms, that is going to be at least one of the ways in which that we can ensure that everyday people are not just passive consumers, but active participants in this digital landscape that we all have the great joy of living through. So I wanted to thank the panel one more time.